What if I told you a single father spent 5 years quietly running a company, only to watch the CEO hand the promotion to her own son, and 2 years later, that same company was forced to call the man it had pushed aside? This isn't a story about revenge. It's about a father who refused to trade his principles for a title, and how one quiet decision changed an entire community when the worst winter storm in years put countless lives at risk. Stay with me, because every choice Ben Carter makes from this moment on leads to an ending no one in that boardroom could have imagined. The first sleet struck the glass walls of HarborReach Mobility just before 9 on Thursday morning. Ben Carter noticed it while standing outside the executive conference room, one hand wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Below him, vans moved through the Kansas City parking lot beneath a sky the color of dirty steel. By evening, the roads would be coated in ice. 3 dialysis clinics had already called about backup routes. Ben should have been downstairs with dispatch. Instead, Margaret Sloan had summoned him upstairs. For 5 years, Ben had handled the problems nobody saw until they became emergencies. He hired drivers, rebuilt schedules, calmed hospital administrators, and answered calls long after the office lights went dark. When Margaret's husband became ill and she began spending more time with investors, Ben quietly carried the company through fuel shortages, staffing gaps, and winter storms. Most people assumed that morning's meeting would finally make the arrangement official. A new brass nameplate sat face down beside Margaret's chair. Ben took the empty seat across from her. His work bag rested by his shoe, the crooked yellow luggage tag tied to its handle. Margaret folded her hands. "Ben, you know how much this company owes you." The sentence made something tighten in his chest. The door opened behind him. Evan Sloan walked in, wearing a charcoal suit and the confident smile of someone arriving late to a meeting that could not begin without him. At 29, Margaret's son had spent 3 years at a consulting firm in Dallas. He had never scheduled a wheelchair van, waited beside a frightened patient, or told a family that their driver was lost in a snowstorm. Margaret turned toward him. Evan will be joining HarborReach as president of operations. For a moment, the only sound was sleet tapping the windows. Evan placed a presentation folder on the table. Ben recognized the blue section tabs immediately. Winter response, driver retention, clinic priority tiers. It was the 5-year emergency plan Ben had written after months of late nights. His name was gone. Evan spoke about modernization, efficiency, and scalable growth. Margaret watched her son with careful pride. Ben stared at a diagram he had drawn on Maisie's kitchen table while she practiced choir songs beside him. When Evan finished, Margaret said, "We need you to help make this transition successful." Ben unclipped his employee badge. Then he untied the yellow tag from his bag and placed both items on the polished table. "I'll finish today's routes," he said. "After that, I'm leaving." Margaret's face changed. "Ben, don't make this about a title." He stood, keeping his voice level. "It isn't." As he reached for the tag, Evan slid a thin document across the table. "Before you go," he said, "I still need your signature." Ben looked down at the first page. The title read, Regional Route Optimization Policy. Beneath it, in smaller print, was a line reserving approval for the operations director. His name had already been typed into the signature block. "I haven't agreed to any of this," Ben said quietly. "You don't have to agree with every decision," Evan replied. "You just have to help us move forward." Ben pushed the document back across the polished table without reading another page. "I won't put my name on something I don't believe in." He picked up the yellow luggage tag, slipped it into his coat pocket, and walked out before anyone answered. The elevator doors closed, leaving the conference room and its silence behind. By the time Ben reached the parking garage, the freezing rain had turned into tiny white pellets that bounced across the windshield of his aging pickup. He sat behind the wheel for nearly a minute before starting the engine. His phone buzzed. Maisie. Don't forget today's permission form. A small smile appeared despite everything. I won't, he texted back. He had made that promise too many times to break it. East of downtown Kansas City, Ben rented a narrow duplex tucked between a tire shop and a corner grocery with a faded red awning. The furnace rattled whenever temperatures dropped below freezing, and the front porch leaned just enough that every spring he promised himself he would fix it. He still hadn't. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon because Maisie insisted oatmeal tasted better with extra cinnamon, even if she forgot to eat half of it before school. 4 years had passed since Lauren died after complications from heart surgery. Sometimes Ben still reached for a second coffee mug before remembering. Sometimes he still caught himself listening for another set of footsteps in the hallway. Grief no longer shouted. It whispered. Maisie was 12 now, tall for her age, freckles across her nose, and an inhaler tucked into nearly every backpack she owned because neither of them ever wanted another asthma scare. On the refrigerator hung spelling quizzes, choir schedules, utility bills, and one photograph of Lauren laughing with flour on her cheek after burning an apple pie. Ben never moved it. That evening, Maisie came through the front door carrying a music folder almost as big as she was. How'd the meeting go? He answered while hanging his coat. Long. She studied his face a little longer than most kids her age would have. You're doing that thing again. What thing? The one where you pretend you're tired when you're actually worried. Ben laughed softly. I didn't know I had a look. You do. She disappeared into her room and returned, holding a bright yellow luggage tag, the edges uneven where she'd cut the plastic herself years ago. She had made it during 3rd grade after the hardest month of their lives. Back then, Ben had been late picking her up from school because a medical transport broke down across town. She had waited with the school secretary until nearly sunset, terrified that everyone she loved kept disappearing. The next morning, she'd handed him the homemade tag. Across the front, in crooked black letters, she'd written, Dad always gets me home. He had tied it to every work bag since. Maisie smiled as she looked at it. You still have it. I always will. She nodded, then slid a folded envelope across the kitchen table. My choir director needs the deposit by Friday if I'm going on the Chicago trip. Ben unfolded the paper. The amount wasn't impossible, but after today, he no longer knew whether he could honestly promise anything. He forced another smile. We'll figure it out. She believed him. That was what frightened him most. Friday arrived with freezing rain sweeping sideways across the city. Ben pulled into HarborReach before sunrise, the parking lot already filling with white vans carrying blue wheelchair symbols on their doors. Dispatch never slept for long. Hospitals opened before daylight, dialysis appointments couldn't wait for better weather, and elderly passengers counted on familiar drivers more than anyone in the office ever realized. As soon as he stepped inside, radios crackled from every corner. Driver 12 is running 15 minutes behind. North Clinic just added another wheelchair pickup. We've got black ice near Independence. Ben hung up his coat and walked straight to the dispatch wall. The giant paper map stretched nearly 8 feet across, dotted with colored pushpins. Red pins marked churches that kept wheelchair-accessible vans. Blue pins marked independent repair garages willing to open before dawn. Green pins marked retired drivers who still answered emergency calls when winter storms shut the city down. Most new employees laughed the first time they saw it, until they needed it. Lena Brooks hurried over carrying a tablet. The software says driver 8 should reroute across Highway 40. Ben glanced toward the windows. No. The system says it'll save 12 minutes. It doesn't know that bridge freezes first. Lena looked surprised. You've driven it? Too many winters. He reached for a dry erase marker, circled another road on the map, and radioed the driver himself. 10 minutes later, the State Patrol announced Highway 40 had been partially closed Because of multiple accidents. Lena stared at him. How did you know? Ben smiled without looking up. I didn't. He tapped the paper map. I knew the people who drive those roads. The morning rolled forward in organized chaos. One dispatcher needed help calming a frightened daughter whose father had missed pickup after a medical appointment ran late. Another driver called because a wheelchair lift refused to lower in freezing temperatures. Ben solved one problem after another without raising his voice. Most visitors assumed Margaret Sloan ran HarborReach. The employees knew differently. Around noon, a young dispatcher hired only 2 weeks earlier wandered toward the old paper map. I've been meaning to ask, he said. Why keep this thing? Everything's digital now. Ben pinned another colored marker beside a rural church. The computer knows where the vans are. He paused just long enough for everyone nearby to look up. It doesn't know who will answer at 2 a.m. Silence settled over the room. Even Lena stopped typing. That afternoon, Ben returned from checking on a stalled vehicle and found Evan standing in front of the map with 2 facilities managers. Evan folded his arms. This wall is coming down. No one spoke. We're installing live scheduling monitors, he continued. This board isn't part of any approved operating system. Ben looked across the hundreds of handwritten notes tucked beneath the pins. Every one represented someone who had once answered a desperate phone call. They're not vendors, Evan said. They're liabilities. He turned to the facilities crew. Take it down Monday morning. Ben's eyes rested on the fading green pin near the north edge of the city. A retired driver had placed it there after volunteering during a blizzard 3 winters earlier. Nobody else in the room even knew his name. Ben did. And for the first time since leaving the conference room, he wondered how many people would quietly disappear once decisions were made by spreadsheets instead of memory. Before anyone could argue, a notification flashed across Lena's monitor. 11 medically necessary dialysis routes had just been flagged for automatic cancellation under the new optimization system. The dispatch room fell silent. Lena looked from the screen to Ben. This has to be a mistake. Ben stepped closer. The software had highlighted every route in yellow, labeling them low profit priority. Most of the patients lived in small towns outside Kansas City, where long drives and fewer daily pickups made the trips expensive. They're not optional, Ben said. They're scheduled for Monday. One dispatcher whispered, some of those patients go 3 times a week. Ben picked up the nearest phone and began calling the clinics one by one. He wasn't changing anything yet. He wanted to know exactly who would be affected if the new policy stayed in place. Within 30 minutes, his desk held handwritten notes beside every route. Mrs. Ellen Pierce, 82, no family nearby. Thomas Green, dialysis every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. A retired school bus driver named Carl who had lost both kidneys but still joked with every dispatcher who answered his calls. To the software, they were numbers. To Ben, they had birthdays, favorite drivers, and doctors who trusted HarborReach to keep them alive. That afternoon, Margaret asked Ben to meet her in her office. The blinds were half closed against the gray sky, and a framed family photograph sat beside the window. Evan appeared in it, smiling beside his mother at a company anniversary dinner years before. Margaret closed the folder on her desk. I know today hasn't been easy. Ben remained standing. The software is eliminating patients who depend on us. It's identifying routes that lose money. It isn't the same thing. She sighed. Ben, this company has changed. Insurance reimbursements are tighter. Fuel costs keep climbing. We have to operate differently. We can operate smarter, he answered. Not smaller. Margaret looked tired. You know Evan isn't trying to hurt anyone. I believe that. The answer caught her off guard. I don't think he's cruel, Ben continued. I think he's looking at spreadsheets instead of people. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, Another HarborReach van rolled through freezing rain toward the garage. Finally, Margaret folded her hands. "He needs time." Ben waited. "I want you to stay beside him for 6 months." She spoke gently, almost like a favor instead of a request. "Help him learn the operation. Guide him. Once he understands the field, things may look different." Ben looked toward the dispatch floor below the office windows. Drivers were pulling on heavy coats before heading back into the storm. "They don't have 6 months," he said quietly. Margaret frowned. "The patients on those 11 routes don't have 6 months to wait while he learns which trips matter." Her expression softened, but she didn't answer. When Ben returned downstairs, Evan was already standing beside Lena's workstation, reviewing another report. He barely looked up. "The optimization model has identified another 23 routes for evaluation." Ben stared at the screen. Every highlighted line represented another person who trusted HarborReach to show up, and for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't sure the company intended to keep that promise. Monday morning arrived with a thin layer of ice still clinging to the parking lot. Drivers stamped snow from their boots as they crossed the garage, laughing about frozen windshields before climbing into vans that would carry people who had nowhere else to turn. Ben was already in dispatch when Evan appeared carrying a leather portfolio. "Conference room," Evan said. "Just the two of us." The room felt smaller than it had a few days earlier. Evan opened the portfolio and slid the same document across the table, this time with several pages attached. "I made revisions," he said. "You'll appreciate them." Ben read silently. The language had changed. The outcome had not. Routes falling below the new profitability threshold would be reviewed automatically, then removed unless special approval was granted by the president of operations. There was one more addition. Regional Operations Manager, Benjamin Carter. His signature was required beneath the implementation plan. Ben looked up. "You've already assigned my name to this." "You built trust with the hospitals," Evan answered calmly. "The drivers trust you. If this comes from me alone, everyone assumes it's corporate politics. And if it comes from me, they'll believe it's necessary." Ben turned another page. Mrs. Ellen Pierce's dialysis route appeared in the sample review. Thomas Green's route appeared on the next. Even the clinic outside Lawrence that served only a handful of patients each week had been highlighted. "You used real routes." "They're examples. They're people." Evan leaned back. "They're losing money." Ben closed the folder. "I spent years convincing hospitals we would never abandon patients because they lived too far away. We're not abandoning anyone. What do you call removing the only ride they have?" Evan hesitated. "They'll find another provider." Ben shook his head. "You don't know that." Silence settled between them. Finally, Evan spoke again, his voice lower this time. "I'm trying to save this company." "So am I." The words hung in the room longer than either man expected. A knock interrupted them. Margaret stepped inside, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She sensed the tension immediately. "Hasn't he signed?" Ben answered before Evan could. "I won't." Margaret placed the coffee on the table. "Ben, please." She sounded less like a chief executive than a tired mother trying to keep 2 people from pulling apart. "You know the financial pressure we're under." "I do." "You know reimbursements keep shrinking." "I do." "Then help us get through this." Ben pushed the folder toward her. "I rewrote the policy." Margaret frowned. Inside was a second proposal Ben had finished the night before. Instead of canceling low-profit medical routes, it shifted non-essential transportation, reorganized maintenance schedules, reduced empty return trips, and created regional partnerships that would cut costs without leaving vulnerable patients behind. Margaret studied the numbers carefully. "It would take longer." "Yes. It depends on community partnership, because communities already help us more than our spreadsheets admit. Before she could answer, Evan closed the folder. "We don't have time for sentimental experiments." Ben stared at him. "No." His voice remained steady. "We don't have time to forget why this company exists." Evan slid the original document back across the table one final time. "If you refuse to sign," he said quietly, "the board will assume you're the obstacle." Ben rested one hand on the yellow luggage tag inside his coat pocket. For the first time, he realized they weren't asking him to accept losing a promotion. They were asking him to lend his reputation to a promise he could never keep. Ben picked up the unsigned policy and folded it once before placing it back on the conference table. "I can't do it." Margaret searched his face. "Think about everything you've built here." "I am." "No," she said softly. "You're thinking about what we're losing." He met her eyes for the first time since entering the room. "I'm thinking about who loses after we do." Nobody spoke. Outside the conference room, dispatch radios crackled through the hallway, followed by the distant rumble of wheelchair lifts lowering onto wet pavement. HarborReach was still moving. Patients still needed rides. Ben walked downstairs without another word. His resignation letter took exactly 3 sentences. It thanked HarborReach for the opportunity to serve the community. It stated that he would not participate in implementing the new routing policy. It offered to complete every responsibility assigned to him before leaving. He printed it, signed it, and placed it on Margaret's desk. Then he went back to work. No announcement was made. No one escorted him from the building. Instead, Ben spent the rest of the afternoon doing exactly what he had done for years. He called the dialysis center outside Olathe to make sure Monday's patients were still scheduled. He left handwritten notes for Lena Brooks explaining which drivers knew certain neighborhoods best after heavy snow. He organized maintenance records so the mechanics would know which wheelchair lifts tended to freeze first during ice storms. Finally, he picked up the phone and called 3 families whose routes had appeared on Evan's cancellation report. He didn't mention resigning. He simply confirmed pickup times and told them HarborReach would be there Monday morning. Each family thanked him as though he had done something extraordinary. He hadn't. He had simply refused to let uncertainty become their burden. As the office slowly emptied, Lena approached his desk. "I heard," she began, then stopped. Ben smiled. "It's true." Her eyes drifted toward the dispatch wall. "What happens now?" "You keep asking questions." She frowned. "What kind of questions?" "The ones the computer can't answer." Before she could reply, Margaret stepped onto the dispatch floor. Most conversations stopped immediately. She walked directly to Ben. "Are you absolutely certain?" He nodded. "This isn't about pride." "I know." "You've given 5 years to this company, and I'd like to remember them with respect." Margaret glanced around the room. Every dispatcher was pretending not to watch. Every driver waiting for new assignments had gone strangely quiet. She lowered her voice. "You could still change your mind." Ben reached into his coat pocket. He placed his employee badge on the desk between them. Then he laid the yellow luggage tag beside it. The bright plastic looked strangely out of place against the gray metal surface. "I have a daughter," he said. Margaret looked down at the tag. "I can't teach her that a title is worth more than keeping your word to people who have no power." He picked up the yellow tag. The badge stayed where it was. Without another sentence, Ben walked toward the exit. Outside, freezing rain tapped softly against the hood of his truck. He climbed inside and rested both hands on the steering wheel before starting the engine. When he reached home, the porch light was already glowing. Maisie opened the front door before he could knock. She smiled at first, then she noticed the yellow tag hanging from his hand instead of his work bag. Her smile slowly disappeared. She looked up at him with quiet, careful eyes. "Dad," her voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you lose your job because of me?" Ben crossed the small entryway in 2 steps. "No," he said. kneeling until they were eye level. Never because of you. Maisie searched his face, trying to decide whether to believe him. You promised you'd pay for Chicago. I know. And now you can't? Ben looked toward the refrigerator, where the choir schedule was held up by a faded magnet shaped like Missouri. I don't know yet, he admitted. It was the first time he had answered her without pretending everything would work out. She nodded once. I'd rather know the truth. That hurt more than if she had cried. Monday arrived without an alarm from HarborReach. For 5 years, Ben had started every weekday before sunrise. His body still woke at 5:10, expecting dispatch radios and coffee that always tasted a little burned. Instead, the duplex was quiet. He packed Maisie's lunch, reminded her to bring her inhaler, and drove her to school beneath low gray clouds. Good luck today, she said before climbing out. With what? Whatever comes next. He smiled. I'll let you know. He didn't. By noon, he had already heard the word overqualified twice. One transportation company wanted someone willing to relocate to Omaha. A logistics firm admired his leadership experience but questioned whether he would fit the culture. A private ambulance service offered overnight shifts that would leave Maisie alone until dawn. He thanked every interviewer. He drove away from every building with the radio off. The numbers began adding themselves together in his head. Rent, utilities, Lauren's remaining hospital bill, health insurance, Maisie's asthma prescription, the Chicago choir deposit. Savings looked comforting on paper. In real life, they disappeared one grocery trip at a time. That weekend, he repaired a neighbor's pickup brake lines for cash. On Sunday, he helped another neighbor deliver appliances across town. He told Maisie he simply liked staying busy. She pretended to believe him. Late Tuesday afternoon, he stopped by the pharmacy. The pharmacist glanced at the screen. Your employer coverage ends at the end of the month. Ben thanked her and folded the receipt into his wallet without saying anything. That evening, he found Maisie at the kitchen table, practicing music. The choir deposit envelope was gone. Did your teacher extend the deadline? He asked. She shook her head. I decided not to go. You decided? It costs a lot. Ben sat down across from her. We didn't make that decision together. She shrugged, staring at the sheet music instead of him. I can sing here. He wanted to tell her they would find the money. Instead, he looked toward the recycling bin beside the pantry. A corner of bright white paper peeked out from beneath an empty cereal box. After Maisie went upstairs, he pulled it free. The Chicago permission form had been folded into quarters before being thrown away. His chest tightened. She wasn't angry. She was making herself smaller because she thought it would make life easier for him. Ben stood alone in the quiet kitchen, the permission form still in his hands. Outside, freezing rain tapped softly against the windows. He folded the paper carefully instead of throwing it back. The next afternoon, another interview ended with another polite rejection. Driving home along a 2-lane road near an aging medical clinic, Ben noticed a familiar wheelchair beside the entrance. An elderly woman sat beneath the awning, wrapped in a blanket, while the wind pushed icy rain across the parking lot. He knew that face. Gloria Reyes. For years, HarborReach had taken her home after dialysis. Today, no van had come. Ben pulled onto the shoulder and hurried toward the clinic entrance. Mrs. Reyes? The elderly woman looked up slowly. Her silver hair peeked out from beneath a knitted hat, and a thick blanket covered her lap. Even from a few feet away, Ben could see how exhausted she was. Her face brightened. Benjamin? She always called him by his full name. I thought you worked today. I don't anymore. She frowned, then glanced toward the empty parking lot. I've been waiting almost 2 hours. Beside her stood a woman in her 40s with worried eyes and a damp winter coat. My name is Elena, she said. I'm her daughter. Dispatch keeps telling me they're trying to find another vehicle. Ben knew exactly what that usually meant. Nobody was coming anytime soon. He looked at his pickup. I can't transport your mother. Elena's shoulders dropped. The wheelchair won't lock safely in my truck, Ben explained. If we hit black ice, she could be hurt. He refused to gamble with someone's life simply because he wanted to help. Instead, he reached into the glove compartment and unfolded a worn notebook. Most people would have opened an app. Ben opened names. Near the back was a handwritten phone number beside the words, St. Andrew Community Church. Lift van, he dialed. After 3 rings, an older man's voice answered. Harold speaking. Harold, it's Ben Carter. There was only a second of silence. Ben, everything all right? I've got Mrs. Gloria Reyes stranded outside Riverside Dialysis. Say no more. You still have the wheelchair van? We do. Can you get here? I'll leave now. Ben checked his watch. Roads are slick. I know every one of them. 45 minutes later, an aging white church van eased into the parking lot. Harold climbed out smiling as though helping people on icy afternoons was the most ordinary thing in the world. It still runs, he joked, patting the hood. Better than most of us. While Harold secured Gloria's wheelchair inside the lift, Ben slipped into the clinic cafeteria. He returned carrying 2 cups of chicken soup and fresh bread. Elena reached for her purse. Please let me pay you. Ben shook his head. Take care of your mom. She tried again. You've already done enough. No. He smiled gently. I've done what somebody should have done. From across the parking lot, Maisie watched everything from the passenger seat of Ben's pickup. She had come straight from school because he hadn't wanted to leave her home alone after another interview. When Gloria's van finally disappeared into the snowy traffic, Maisie climbed down from the truck. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, she reached into Ben's coat pocket. The tag. He handed it to her. She turned it over and borrowed a marker from the dashboard. Without asking permission, she carefully wrote 2 new words beneath the old message. Not just me. Ben looked at the uneven letters for a long time. The yellow tag had once meant one frightened little girl waiting after school. Now it meant something larger. It meant showing up for anyone who had been forgotten. The next morning, his phone rang before breakfast. Then it rang again. And again. A senior center, a dialysis clinic, a neighborhood church. Each one asked the same question. We heard what you did yesterday. There was a brief pause. Could you help us make sure this never happens again? Ben looked out the kitchen window before answering. Snow had settled along the fence behind the duplex. Maisie was leaving for school with her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders, waving before disappearing around the corner. He realized something. People weren't calling to hire a transportation company. They were calling because they no longer knew whom they could trust. I'll come by this afternoon, he finally said. The first meeting took place in the fellowship hall of St. Andrew Community Church. The folding chairs didn't match. The coffee was weak. A space heater rattled in the corner. Around the table sat a dialysis clinic administrator, the director of a senior center, 2 church volunteers, a retired shuttle driver, and a woman introducing herself as community attorney Rachel Dunn. Ben spread a legal pad across the table. I don't want to replace HarborReach, he began. Everyone looked surprised. I want to connect the people already helping. He drew circles across the page. Church vans, senior center buses, accessible vehicles sitting unused after school hours, independent mechanics willing to answer emergency calls, volunteer drivers with medical transport certification. They all exist, Ben said. They just don't know each other. Rachel leaned forward. If you build this, it needs liability protection, operating agreements, and emergency procedures. Ben nodded. I know transportation. And I know paperwork, Rachel answered with a smile. Looks like we're both busy. Within 3 months, HomeLine Access Network existed, not as a fleet, not as another transportation company, as a bridge. When one organization couldn't reach a patient, another already knew where to go. A church van covered a canceled clinic route. A retired mechanic repaired wheelchair lifts before dawn. A school district allowed unused, accessible buses to serve medical trips during summer break. Ben spent more hours on the phone than he thought possible. Some mornings began before sunrise. Some nights ended after midnight. He answered every call himself. Rachel watched him work for several weeks before closing his office door one evening. The office was barely larger than a storage room above an old hardware store. Invoices covered one wall. County maps covered another. You need to hire someone. I can't afford it. You can't afford not to. Ben smiled tiredly. I'll manage. Rachel folded her arms. That's exactly what worries me. The first employee arrived 2 weeks later anyway. Not because Ben had planned it, because he finally admitted Rachel was right. A former dispatcher named Miguel joined part-time to answer evening calls. Business improved. The workload didn't. One Friday evening, Ben promised Maisie he would be at her school choir concert by 6:30. At 6:15, a nursing home called about 2 stranded wheelchair patients. Ben handled the crisis himself. When he quietly entered the school auditorium nearly 40 minutes late, parents were already standing to applaud. Maisie saw him from the stage. She smiled, but something behind her smile had changed. Driving home, she stared out the passenger window. Dad? Yeah? You keep helping everybody. I try, she nodded. I'm proud of you. He smiled. Then she added quietly, but sometimes it feels like everybody gets part of you. The truck became very still. And I get what's left. Ben tightened his hands around the steering wheel. Those words stayed with him longer than any business meeting. The following Monday, he called Miguel into the office. I need you to take the overnight emergency line. Miguel blinked. You trust me with that? Ben looked at the yellow luggage tag hanging beside his desk. For years he had believed being dependable meant answering every phone call himself. Maybe he had been wrong. I do. That night, for the first time since HomeLine began, Ben let his phone remain silent on the kitchen counter. At 2:14 a.m., the overnight emergency line rang. Miguel answered. And before sunrise, the decision Ben had feared making became the one that changed HomeLine forever. The call came from a rehabilitation center after an accessible shuttle broke down on an icy county road. Normally, Ben would have grabbed his keys before the second ring. Instead, he lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, while Miguel coordinated the response. One church van, one retired driver, one mechanic willing to leave home before dawn. 43 minutes later, every passenger had reached the rehabilitation center safely. When Ben arrived at the office that morning, Miguel looked almost embarrassed. I kept waiting for something to go wrong. Did it? Miguel smiled. No. Ben smiled back, though the feeling surprised him. For the first time since HomeLine began, people had been helped without him carrying every decision alone. Rachel noticed immediately. I told you, she said, setting a stack of contracts on his desk. A good system shouldn't depend on one exhausted man. Ben glanced toward the yellow luggage tag hanging beside the office map. Maybe leadership wasn't proving you could answer every call. Maybe it was making sure someone always could. The months passed quietly. HomeLine never became the biggest transportation network in Missouri. It became the most dependable. Dialysis clinics renewed agreements. Senior centers recommended them. Hospital discharge planners began asking a different question. Can HomeLine coordinate this? Not because HomeLine owned more vehicles, because it knew who would actually show up. Across town, HarborReach looked successful from the outside. New software filled the dispatch walls. Quarterly reports pleased investors. But behind the polished numbers, Small cracks widened. Experienced drivers retired earlier than expected. Several dispatchers quietly resigned. Clinic managers complained that nobody could approve changes without waiting for headquarters. Drivers stopped making judgment calls, afraid the computer would flag them for breaking protocol. One afternoon, Margaret Sloan received a comparison report from St. Luke's Medical Center. She expected to see HarborReach leading every category. Instead, one page held her attention. Technology integration. HarborReach, excellent. Emergency response. Reliability, HomeLine, excellent. Patient satisfaction. During severe weather, HomeLine, highest regional rating. Margaret read the report twice. Then she drove to dispatch herself. The old paper map was gone. Large digital screens covered the wall where colored pushpins had once stood. Everything looked cleaner. Everything looked modern. Yet somehow, the room felt quieter. Later that week, Evan entered Margaret's office carrying another set of quarterly numbers. "We're losing smaller contracts," he admitted, "but that's expected." "To whom?" "Mostly HomeLine." He shrugged. "They're leveraging relationships Ben built while he worked here." Margaret looked up. Did he take client files? No. Employee lists? No. Pricing? No. She closed the folder slowly. Then he didn't take anything that belonged to HarborReach. Evan frowned. He took the relationships. Margaret shook her head. No. Her voice was softer than before. People chose to follow him. Outside her office window, snow drifted across the parking lot. For the first time, Margaret wondered whether the most valuable thing Ben had ever built had never appeared on a balance sheet. It wasn't software. It wasn't scheduling. It wasn't even transportation. It was trust. Late that evening, television meteorologists interrupted regular programming. A wide band of freezing rain stretched across Kansas and western Missouri. The National Weather Service upgraded the forecast. The announcer's voice remained calm, but the warning was unmistakable. This could become the most significant ice storm the Kansas City region has experienced in more than a decade. Ben stood silently in the HomeLine office, watching the radar spread across the television screen. Then every phone on the wall began ringing almost at once. Miguel answered the first call. HomeLine Access. His expression changed immediately. "It's Mercy Dialysis. Their afternoon patients can't get home." Rachel picked up another line. "A nursing home just lost power." A third phone rang. Before she finished speaking, an elementary school needed an accessible bus for a child using portable respiratory equipment. Within minutes, the office filled with maps, radios, and ringing phones. No one raised their voice. Everyone simply started moving. Miguel contacted church volunteers. Rachel called county emergency management. Ben pinned colored markers across the new wall map, assigning vehicles one after another. Outside, freezing rain coated every street in clear ice. The city slowed to a crawl. Then Ben's cell phone vibrated. The screen showed a name he hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. Margaret Sloan. He let it ring once before answering. "Ben." She sounded calm. Too calm. "What's happening?" "Our dispatch servers are down." He closed his eyes. "Backup system." "It isn't responding." "What about manual routing?" A long silence answered him. "We eliminated the paper system." Ben looked at the map covering HomeLine's wall. Hundreds of handwritten notes, phone numbers, volunteer contacts, alternate loading locations, everything Evan had called outdated. Margaret continued. "The highway closures weren't updating. Our drivers are waiting for authorization. Several vans are sitting at the depot because no one can assign new routes." Another pause. "We have dialysis patients stranded." Ben didn't answer. "We also lost power at Maple Grove Senior Living." He recognized the facility immediately. 38 residents, many requiring wheelchairs, some needing oxygen support. The backup generator failed. Rachel watched Ben's face from across the room. She already knew who was calling. Margaret's voice became quieter. "I need your help." Before Ben could respond, another phone rang beside Miguel. He covered the receiver. Children's Hospital says a boy with a portable ventilator needs transportation before the battery reserve expires. Ben looked from Miguel to Rachel. Every second mattered. Rachel stepped closer after he ended the call. You know what HarborReach did to you? I do. You owe them nothing. I know. They're your competitor now. Ben rubbed both hands across his face. They're asking because people could get hurt. Rachel nodded slowly. And if you help them, HomeLine loses its biggest advantage. Ben stared at the weather radar. Blue and purple bands covered nearly the entire region. The phones never stopped ringing. Miguel quietly continued assigning church vans. Volunteer drivers checked in one after another. Retired mechanics opened garages. Everything Ben had spent 2 years building was already working. HarborReach had newer software, more specialized vehicles, bigger contracts. Yet tonight, they couldn't move. HomeLine owned fewer resources, but every phone number on Ben's wall belonged to someone who would answer. His own phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't Margaret. It was Maisie. Dad? I'm here. I saw the weather. It's getting worse. She hesitated. Are you going to help them? Ben looked through the office window as ice gathered on the parking lot. I don't know. Maisie's voice remained gentle. If you don't... She stopped for a moment. Who stays outside? The room suddenly felt very quiet, not because the phones had stopped ringing, because Ben already knew the answer. It wouldn't be executives. It wouldn't be investors. It would be frightened families waiting beside hospital doors, elderly people sitting in dark nursing homes, patients wondering whether anyone was still coming. He reached for his coat. Then he picked up the yellow luggage tag hanging beside the map. For just a second, he ran his thumb across the words Maisie had written. Not just me. Ben slipped the yellow tag into his coat pocket and looked around the HomeLine office. Miguel, he said, keep coordinating every call that comes in. Rachel, I need you with me. He picked up Margaret's call. I'll help, he said, before she could speak. But these are my conditions. He listed them one by one. Medical need comes before company contracts. Your drivers can refuse unsafe roads without discipline. No emergency passenger will be billed extra. And every decision we make tonight gets documented for an independent review afterward. Margaret didn't argue. You have my word. No, Ben answered quietly. Tonight, I need more than your word. When he arrived at HarborReach, the building looked strangely unfamiliar. The polished dispatch room that had once replaced his paper map glowed with frozen computer screens. Supervisors stood around them helplessly, while phones rang unanswered. Drivers waited beside their vans with engines running, unable to receive new assignments. Evan stood in the middle of the room, trying to restart a system that refused to respond. Ben didn't waste a second. Clear this table. Someone rolled out a large sheet of butcher paper. Ben spread a fresh road map across it. Colored markers appeared. Church vans, school buses equipped with wheelchair lifts, volunteer drivers, independent mechanics, county shelters. One by one, names replaced error messages. Miguel relayed updates from HomeLine. Rachel coordinated with emergency management. HarborReach drivers, freed from waiting on frozen software, began taking handwritten assignments instead. For 14 straight hours, the room never became quiet. By sunrise, the last dialysis patient had reached treatment. Residents from Maple Grove had been relocated before the building lost heat completely. The young boy with the portable ventilator reached Children's Hospital with battery time to spare. No headlines celebrated the moment. Most families never knew how close the night had come to ending differently. As exhausted employees gathered around the dispatch floor, Margaret walked to the center of the room. She looked first at Ben, then at her son. Evan, she said, you're no longer directing emergency operations. Nobody spoke. This crisis exposed failures I approved. She took a slow breath. I'll accept responsibility before the board. Evan lowered his eyes. For the first time since Ben had met him, he looked less like an executive and more like a man discovering that good intentions could still hurt people. Weeks later, HarborReach announced an independent review of its emergency policies. Driver safety protections were restored. Community partnerships returned. Representatives from hospitals, drivers, and patient advocates were added to an oversight council. Evans stepped away from executive authority and began working alongside field managers to understand the operation from the ground up. Margaret offered Ben his old position. He smiled gently. I've already found where I belong. Instead, HarborReach and HomeLine signed an agreement creating a permanent regional emergency transportation partnership. No single company would control it. The community would. A year later, Ben sat in the third row of Maisie's choir concert. His phone vibrated once inside his coat. He glanced at the screen. Miguel had already handled the situation. Ben smiled, silenced the phone, and looked back toward the stage. When the concert ended, Maisie walked over, holding a small gift. She removed the worn yellow luggage tag from his keyring. The edges were faded now. The ink had almost disappeared. I made you a new one, she said. On the front, she had carefully written, Dad always gets me home. He turned it over. On the back were 5 simple words, and he taught others how. Outside, snow drifted softly across the parking lot. A HarborReach wheelchair van pulled away beside a church shuttle, carrying elderly passengers home under HomeLine's yellow road symbol. Ben watched them disappear into the winter morning. 2 years earlier, he thought he had walked away from everything that mattered. Instead, he had walked toward something far greater than a title. He had built a promise strong enough that it no longer depended on just one man to keep it. Instead, he had walked toward something far greater than a title. He had built a promise strong enough that it no longer depended on just one man to keep it. When Maisie handed Ben that new yellow luggage tag, she wasn't thanking him for getting his old job back. She was honoring the father who chose to keep his principles, even when it cost him everything he thought he had worked for. This story reminds us that real dignity isn't measured by the position someone gives you. It's measured by the promises you refuse to break, even when keeping them comes with a price. Today, think of one person who quietly carries responsibility without recognition. A simple thank you, a phone call, or offering your help might mean more than you realize. And the next time life feels unfair, remember what Ben chose to build, instead of holding on to bitterness. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment with 1 below. I'd also love to know, if you had been in Ben's position, would you have helped HarborReach during the storm, or would you have walked away? Stay with us, because the next story explores another quiet act of courage that changes more lives than anyone expects.